Well, welcome everybody. It's really good to see you. And today we're going to continue our exploration of our big question for 2020. What is the relationship between science and religion in today's world? It's good to see some familiar faces, and some of you have been following the big questions for going on 4 years now. And it's really gratifying to welcome newcomers. So I'd like to thank Will McGarvey for hosting the Zoom and for being our main speaker today. He's truly a man of many abilities. Susie Cole, would like to thank Susie, who's the president of the Interfaith Council, for supporting the big questions for all of these years. And special thanks goes out to the Big Questions Committee, Ruth Ahern, Channing Miller, and Gloria Sunshine. So for hundreds of years, science and religion have often been at odds. They seem to be vastly different realms. I decided to kind of look into the big questions a little more by asking another question. What do science and religion have in common? What do science and religion have in common? One aspect of reality that science and religion seem to have in common is relationship. Relationship. In religion, we can talk of having a relationship with the divine by way of energy exchange or through personality interaction, through prayer, meditation, chanting, dancing, worship. And this relationship can make a dynamic difference in our lives. And I'm sure most of you have some practice that you enjoy that brings you closer to the one. Last month, I shared research in the field of neurotheology that has been going on for many years. Dr. Andrew Newberg, an expert in neuroimaging studies of spiritual experiences. Have you got that? Neuroimaging studies of spiritual experiences scanned the brains of praying nuns, chanting Sikhs, and meditating Buddhists. He found that certain areas of the brain lit up, which means that they were receiving more energy while they were praying, chanting, and meditating. And that people who engaged in these kinds of practices experienced feelings of awe, peace, and a divine connection. It could be said that they experienced being in relationship with divinity. Then I stand for an understanding of relationship in the world of science, and not being a scientist and barely understanding the stuff. I did find that in the quantum world, relationship is thought to be the key determiner of everything. And that seems to be common in all of the realms of science. So as we investigate subatomic particles, they are observed only as they are in relationship to something else. Margaret Wheatley, an organizational theorist in systems, said in her book, Leadership in the New Sciences, the unseen connections between what were previously thought to be separate entities are the fundamental ingredient of all creation. So the relationship between atoms, electrons, molecules can be seen as the patterns and energy of life. Think of astronomy, the relationship of the planets, the suns to each other. And if you will excuse the example, even in virology, dealing with the coronavirus, relationships is necessary between the virus and its host in order for it to replicate. Just another example of science. Everything alive or that has energy can be described as an open system that engages with its environment and continues to grow and evolve, to be in relationship. So a case can be made that science and religion have a common foundation, relationship. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Reverend Will McGarvey. He serves as the Executive Director of the Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County and as pastor of Community Presbyterian Church of Pittsburgh. He did his studies at San Francisco Theological Seminary, where he specialized in spiritual practices and the theology of the environment. Reverend Will is active in many justice-seeking endeavors, including LGBTQ inclusion, comprehensive immigration reform, hunger relief, affordable housing, poverty alleviation, and peacemaking in Israel and Palestine. After Reverend McGarvey speaks, there will be a time for questions and comments from you. Maybe raising your hand, is a good way. Let us know you'd like to speak. And then we will break out into smaller groups for more personal sharing. So at this time, please welcome Reverend Will McGarvey.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So glad to be here with you. And we'll light a little candle to recognize that Spirit is always with us. I also want to give thanks to Chris Palmer, who gave the last presentation in this series, and he's with us today. And good to see you, Chris, and other folks that are here with us. As we let me get ourselves set up here. And can you see that? All right. Great. That will let me see if there's still people joining our conversation. Thanks so much. And so glad that we're here together today, and especially thinking about this topic on science and religion. I just wanted to share our new logo for the Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County, which includes our new motto, Caring, Diversity, and Compassion. And then you might see this a little bit more with the name inside of the circle of our interfaith groups of faith traditions and life philosophies that are a part of the 108 congregations, monasteries, and retreat centers, and individuals who make up the Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County. And as I was thinking of this, I wanted to just recognize that when we come to these kinds of conversations, that we often come with a lot of our own history, a lot of our own cosmology, and just recognize that our ability to be able to be in conversation really does depend on where we've been and how we have been in communion and conversation with others. So as we come to this moment, I love this quote from Stephen Hawking. It surprises me how disinterested we are today about things like physics, space, the universe, and philosophy of our existence, our purpose, our final destination. It's a crazy world out there. Be curious. We're also living in an amazingly diverse time as we are learning more and more about the natural world. So one of the first things that I did when I started my ministry was I signed on to a clergy letter and started using and becoming a part of this movement, at least within the Christian tradition, where people, especially religious leaders, were invited to sign on to this Clergy Letter Project, and I'm going to share a little bit of that. But if you could see, there's over 17,000 religious leaders from different groups that have signed on to this letter over the years. 15,642 are Christian, 830 are rabbis, 684 are Unitarian Universalist clergy, 75 Buddhist clergy, and 54 humanist clergy. Humanists are the latest group to be added to the federal approved groups of folks of faith traditions and life philosophies to provide chaplains in the federal penitentiaries. So this Dr. Michael Zimmerman is the person who put together this letter, and it basically says, within the community of Christian believers, there are areas of dispute and disagreement, including the proper way to interpret Holy Scripture. While virtually all Christians take the Bible seriously and hold it to be authoritative in matters of faith and practice, the overwhelming majority do not read the Bible literally, as they would a science textbook. Many of the beloved stories found in the Bible, the creation, Adam and Eve, Noah, and the ark, convey timeless truths about God, human beings, and the proper relationship between creator and creation, expressed in the only form capable of transmitting these truths from generation to generation. Religious truth is of a different order from scientific truth. Its purpose is not to convey scientific information, but to transform hearts. We, the undersigned Christian clergy from many different traditions, believe that the timeless truths of the Bible and the discoveries of modern science may comfortably coexist. We believe that the theory of evolution is a foundational scientific truth, one that has stood up to rigorous scrutiny, and upon which much of human knowledge and achievement rests. To reject this truth or to treat it as one theory among others is to deliberately embrace scientific ignorance and transmit such ignorance to our children. We believe that among God's good gifts are human minds capable of critical thought, and that the failure to fully employ this gift is a rejection of the will of our Creator. To argue that God's loving plan of salvation for humanity precludes the full employment of the God-given faculty of reason is to attempt to limit God, an act of hubris. We urge school board members to preserve the integrity of the science curriculum by affirming the teaching of the theory of evolution as a core component of human knowledge. We ask that science remain science and that religion remain religion, two very different but complementary forms of truth. Some folks, like my colleague who's in Pacific Grove here, Dr. David Loy, who's an author of multiple books, actually added some statements of their own to why they signed on to this document. He said, "I'm a scientist deeply appreciative of Michael Zimmerman's initiative and Clergy Letter Project because of my firm conviction that we all treasure as humanity, all that we treasure as humanity is doomed unless progressive science and progressive religion can form a close working partnership to combat the grim thrust backward of regressive religion and regressive science." Here's my background. Into my teens, like Darwin, I dabbled with the idea of becoming a minister. Then, after an immersion in Freud, shifted to psychology, and then midlife into the development of evolutionary systems science, and became a co-founder of the pioneering multinational General Evolution Research Group, a co-founder of World Futures, the Journal of General Evolution, and founder of the Darwin Project. Through my widely acclaimed recovery and reconstruction of Darwin's long-ignored moral and spiritual-oriented completion of his theory of evolution, see his website, increasing perception of how this old paradigm Darwinism, as well as right-wing creationism, is driving us towards destruction, I became convinced of two basic requirements for human survival. One, there must be a massive shift from the old paradigm Darwinism of survival of the fittest and selfish genes, driving us toward environmental, political, economic, and moral and spiritual destruction, toward the paradigm of mutual aid, love, moral sensitivity, and education. And two, only the working partnership sketched above could do the job and head off the steady, decade by decade and century by century destruction of all that we and the best among us have held dear. So while some folks have posited that there's a conflict between science and religion, I really join a lot of other progressive Christians in viewing not just a complementarity between the two, but that both of them are speaking different kinds of truth in different parts of our conversation. And part of it, I think, is a recognition that we're meaning-making animals, and that as Darwin did his best to try to figure out how we came to be who we are, there's also a certain amount of human hubris that keeps us from recognizing that we are created beings and that we're animals, and meaning-making animals at that. And as we look at the history of the world, it's easy to try to put pictures of Noah's Ark and dinosaurs in the same picture, as some people do. I don't think we have to do that to try to read the Bible as a history book in that way. And so it's interesting when you have debates between Ken Ham and Bill Nye, the science guy, and they ask each other, what would make you change your mind? Ken Ham would say nothing, and Bill Nye the Science Guy would say evidence. And I would actually agree with Bill Nye on this, that there is a difference in the way that we look at the world. And especially recognizing that we often view ourselves as more than animals, and in many ways we are, and at the same time we continue to be animals that evolved on this planet. So if we're to deny that we're human animals, it really is a denial also of any earth-based spirituality that we have. So when we look at this, I like to point out a little bit more about the Bible, and especially how conversations around that can be helpful or non-helpful. I love this cartoon. Quit worrying about corroborating your sources. It's not as if anyone's going to take this literally. I think there is a misunderstanding in the way that we read things as modern Americans, and it's interesting to see some people trying to do so in a very literal way, but I think they're doing that because of number one, the history of Protestantism lost the apostolic succession that the Roman Catholic Church had. And so when Christians talk about where their authority comes from, if they don't have apostolic succession, then oftentimes they point to the Bible itself, and taking that Bible as literally as possible to protect against the encroaching ideology of modernism tends to be the answer for them. But what that has led to is a lot of folks really checking their brains at the door when they go to church. And I don't think that we want to do that either. And it's exactly not what I do when I go to church. I want to have my mind stimulated in thought, as well as really considering how I'm called to be able to live as a rational, reasonable person in the world. So oftentimes these two methods get compared to one another. The creationist method, here's the conclusion, what facts can we find to support it, versus the scientific method, what are the facts, what conclusions can we draw from them? And in some ways what we've seen is that there's become two different worlds between science and religion, and they've rarely even talked until the last 20 or 30 years. There's a Center for the Theology of Natural Sciences at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and it was great to be able to take courses there where religious leaders and theologians were able to offer the cosmology and the worldview that they have to the science world, to see if there's somehow just that cosmology and way of looking at the world might offer science a new paradigm shift with which to be able to make the next advances in understanding our world as well. But oftentimes this conflict has been really elevated, especially between the religious right and science. And I think partly because both groups have been trying to wrest power away from each other. So we've seen accusations that science has little responsibility to be moral, and that religion has little responsibility to think, even though I don't think that that's completely true. It's it's easy to say that the two worlds do lunch, that they talk, but that they really do have different cosmologies and ways of looking at the world, especially as science tries to figure out the how. Religion continues to be the group and religious leaders asking the why questions, and really asking how do we make meaning of this new knowledge, and what are the ethics and morality that we should be talking about? How do we create especially boundaries around ethics? And bioethics tends to be one of those new burgeoning fields, especially in hospitals and other places. So we see that the two worlds are interrelated, but they often speak past each other. Even Darwin said of his theory, there's grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator. And of course, we've been encouraged to integrate the two worlds. Both the scientist and the theologian need to live in humility of knowledge, knowing that any future knowledge that we may learn about the world and the universe can change the way that we view the universe. Science unchecked can become immoral, and religion unchecked can become superstition. And so oftentimes, as we've seen these as two separate endeavors, I think as more and more of the leaders in these fields have been talking to each other, I think they've been recognizing how they can not just complement but challenge each other into being better use of each of their worldviews. As Einstein said, science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. It can lead to superstitions, and we can even create versions of science that leads and looks a lot like idolatry. I love this statement from the Dalai Lama: if science proves some belief of Buddhism wrong, then Buddhism will have to change. That really is where I would view myself as coming down as well. As Silja Bundgaard said, the biggest knock on science are the blind spots of the domain to the ethical implications of research, the moral dimensions of technology. I think that's really true, especially around technologies like the nuclear bomb that we have that can do away with all life. We need to be able to think ethically around that. And even theologically, as John Houghton said, there's a widespread suspicion of science fostered by the feelings that science goes against the Bible. This is unfortunate. It takes a very small view of God and a very inadequate view of science. I think that's true too. St. Thomas Aquinas has this statement that it's actually one of my favorite quotes. It's a great test, I think, for theology, especially as we're looking at applying theology in the world. If you make a mistake about creation, you'll necessarily make a mistake about God. And I think this is even true for human nature. And the more we think about the relationship between science, religion, morality, ethics, the more I think we need to be much more humble and careful with some of the language that we have. Of course, as D.T. Suzuki said, to point at the moon, a finger is needed, but woe to those who take the finger for the moon, right? But we often do that with our relationship with language. It's easy to mistake the finger pointing at the moon for what the moon itself really is, and to get those references confused. Faith is not mistaking symbols for the things they point to, worshiping the finger that is pointing at the moon. Sometimes it seems it's all you've got, the one thing left to cling to, and sometimes you let go and find that it grabs hold of you. There's lots of different ways of responding to this. I like this little quote: most of what I learn about spirituality comes from watching how you treat other people, yourself and other people daily. And I think actions really are stronger than words. And I think it's been interesting to find Episcopalians and Presbyterians and UCCers and other progressive Christians really separating themselves from this religious right view that demands a conflict with science. My United Church of Christ even says God is still speaking and we're listening, recognizing that as we go back to Scripture time and time again, we might be able to hear a new word where God might speak more light into the present. One of my UCC colleagues, Michael Dowd, is a UCC minister, and he went on tour for about 10 years. He wrote this book, Thank God for Evolution, How the Marriage of Science and Religion Will Transform Your Life and Our World. And he took this on the road and really helped a lot of people understand the beauty in this relationship between science and religion, and how it can be a mutually beneficial relationship if the relationship is done well. And lately he's been doing a lot of work thinking about our ecological footprint on the world, and how close we are to these tipping points of climate chaos and what that might mean for us theologically. But a lot of these conversations go back to the way that we interpret Scripture, the way that we hear a lot of these stories. I love this cartoon. Eat plenty of fruit and learn to multiply. That way you won't pollute your bodies in the earth with animal agriculture and reproduce faster than the planet can support. Yeah, we should have written that down. What was that again? Be fruitful and multiply, I think. I would love it if we had religious leaders all over the world actually say, this is the one commandment we've completed, and let's check it off. If the Pope and the Archpatriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church and leaders of the world Council of Churches got together and said, we have been fruitful and we have multiplied. There's now 7.7 billion of us on the planet. We're going to see more human suffering if we don't figure out how to decrease our numbers closer to the carrying capacity of our world. Then I think we really need to be able to move beyond parts of those conversations. But even the way that we read the Bible plays itself into this. And often in our English translations, it begins with this traditional phrase, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. But when you look at the Hebrew, it actually has a subjunctive clause there. A better Hebrew translation of those words would be when God first began to create, the heavens and the earth being void and a part of the waters of chaos. And what we often don't get is how the actual cosmology of the ancients is radically different than the way that we view the world right now. So this is an ancient Israelite cosmology. It's a flat earth cosmology that has a dome of a firmament holding the waters of chaos, these waters above, separated from the waters below. It's a three-tiered universe. Sheol is the underworld. This is the world where we live. God lives above those waters of chaos in the heavens. But it's a series of separations on Genesis 1 and these different days of creation. So the first day is just separating the surface of the waters, and waters above and the waters below. And then this firmament gets put into this world that keeps those waters of chaos above the firmament, and there's still waters below. And then out of that is separated lands and sea. And then you can see the sun and the moon and the stars are inside this firmament. And there's waters of chaos above that firmament. And so if we're to take the Bible literally, this is the cosmology of the ancient Israelites. It's a three-tiered universe where there's water above the firmament, water and land in this version, and Sheol underneath, the underworld, where the ancestors' bodies are buried, and where one day you too will be buried in the bosom of Abraham. And so this is not the way that we view the universe today, but it is the way that some of the writers of Genesis 1 may have looked at it, and it may have been influenced by the...
She said she was going to...
They may have been influenced by the Babylonian texts and maybe even by other creation stories that were out there. But what's interesting is this story separates these days, and then the male and the female are both automatically placed within here. And you can tell that there's a difference between this Genesis 1 to chapter 2, verses 2 or 3. And it looks very much like a heteronormative, just male and female, that's it. The Talmud, of course, has all sorts of other stories about Lilith, who was the first wife in the Genesis 1 story, versus Eve, who gets created in the second story, because there's both a man and a woman referred to in this version of the story. So that's... it's not encouraging a heteronormative nuclear family kind of cosmology. And if anything, when you look at these days, day 1 corresponds to day 4, day 2 corresponds to day 5, day 3 corresponds to day 6. And while days 1, 2, and 3 are the separation of the waters and the land and the air, day 4, 5, and 6 are the filling up of the air and the sea and filling up of the land animals. And then there's this seventh day, which seems out of order. There's no correspondence to this seventh day with the previous 6. So that must be the main thing that this high Hebrew poetry is pointing us to. And that means that we are created for rest. We're created for Sabbath. And just as the birds were created to fill the air and the fish were created to fill the seas, the land animals were created to fill the land. Humans kind of come at the end of this, and even God rests from their work. That means that the point of the story is Sabbath, that we were created for Sabbath to be able to enjoy the fruits of our own labor. And what's interesting is that the theology of the Sabbath that gets described here in the first creation story of Genesis is also a way of understanding ourselves as in contradiction to the Babylonian creation myths that had humans created as the slaves of the gods, especially of Marduk, and created from that god's blood. So it's an idyllic picture that we're created to be able to enjoy our life here on earth. We're created for rest. We're created to be able to enjoy the fruits of our own labors, to be able to be a part of community, to enjoy life. And I think that's the simplest, most literal way we can interpret Genesis 1. And at the same time, the way we look at this and the way that we view the universe itself can be very different from time to time. Stanley Yaki is a Catholic theologian who wrote this book on Genesis 1 through the ages, and he points out that through the history just of Christian thought, that there's many different ways that people have interpreted where the earth is. Some have put the earth in the center of the universe or the solar system. Some put the sun in the middle, and then the earth and the moon are off to the side. Copernicus had his own way of describing it. Other folks in other ages have been able to view ourselves as a part of a greater Milky Way, and recognizing that our night sky consists of this small selection of the very brightest and nearest stars in those areas. And in some ways, this is an amazing gift to us that science has given us, is to be able to picture ourselves within the universe and to know exactly how much other life may have sentience like ourselves. It gives us a truer picture of our place in the universe. And even understanding the Big Bang Theory and understanding how far we've come and how the universe has been different in different ages over the last 13.87 billion years gives us a sense of our own humility that we can and should have as we consider that. And even understanding more about black holes, right? Understanding that there might even be multiple universes on the other side of these black holes, and the dense gravity that occurs and the diversity that occurs within all of this, and the interrelatedness, as Sarah pointed out, at a subatomic level. So some of the folks that have been most helpful for me are process theologians, and I'll be talking a little bit more about this later, but I just want to give you a brief introduction that process theology sees the universe as creative, interrelational, dynamic, and open to the future. In process theology, God is relational, present in every moment of our lives and in all entities and levels of being. The world is interconnected, in effect, a giant ecosystem where what harms or blesses one harms or blesses all. John Hartshorne, one of the earlier process theologians, said that God is less an active force within the world's processual commerce than an intelligent being or mind. And his God is less a force of some sort than a personal being who interacts with the other mind-endowed agents through personal contact and love. Hartshorne wants neither to separate God from the world too sharply, nor yet to have to be pantheistically immanent in nature, an intelligent world-separating being who participates experientially in everything. And I think a lot of this is in response to the world that God is omnipotent and omniscient and all-powerful and all-present and able to be a puppet master over the universe. And it's a rejection of that kind of philosophical description that God has to be all-powerful in order to be God. And if anything, it allows God to be a part of the universe that lures us into our best selves. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Let me take a little diversion by just pointing out a different creation story. Here's a portion of Plato's Symposium as he tried to share this creation myth that humans were originally created with 4 arms and 4 legs and a head with 2 faces. And fearing their power, Zeus split them into 2 separate parts, condemning them to spend their lives in search of their other halves. And this is where we hear perhaps influences us in thinking that that we have a soulmate somewhere. and that this ancient Greek creation myth said that we were originally created as two people in one, and that God somehow cut us in half because we were too powerful with 4 arms and 4 legs. And that as God cut us in half, our job is to find that other half of our soulmate elsewhere in the world. And that's one way of looking at the universe that I think does influence the next creation story. But it's one where human nature was originally one and we were a whole, and the desire and pursuit of the whole was called love, and that we were created to be able to be in relationship. So I think it recognizes that part of who we are, that we are created for community and relationship. And perhaps this story influenced the next creation story in Genesis 2, which tells the creation from a different view. Instead of from the view of the heavens and the earth, this one starts with the earth and the heavens. And it's in a garden called Eden, and inside that garden is an earthling called Adamah. Now, we've taken the name of the Adam, which comes out of the Adamah, the ground or the soil, as a given name. And as the telling of the story in the early verses of Genesis 2, God starts with the creation of this earthling, creates the body of the earthling out of the mud, puts it together out of this red clay, and then breathes into the earthling after the earthling has been formed. And it's with this breath, this ruah of this breath or spirit, it's related to the word for spirit in Hebrew, becomes a living being, becomes an earthling. There's no gender in this being yet in the story. It influences a later Christian ritual on Ash Wednesday that starts Lent, where we recognize that we're made from dust and to dust we shall return. But it puts us in relationship with all of the animals. And it basically says that the earthling was made first, and then all of these other animals were made. And partly because the earthling was lonely. And so God makes all these animals, asks the earthling to name them, and it doesn't look like any of these helpmates, these relatable animals, are equal enough to the earthling for them to be less lonely. And so there's this recognition that the beasts of the field were there, but they're not quite of the same relatable material as the conscious earthling is. And so God separates an Isha out of the Ish. There's lots of Hebrew word plays in this portion of Genesis 2. The Isha, the woman, comes out of the Ish and comes out of the rib. And it's said that the earthling is put under a deep sleep, and that then God separates a woman out of the man. And that and this is the naming of Adam and Eve from this portion of the conversation. It's different than the woman and the man referred to in Genesis 1, who were kind of the apex of creation. Here the earthling is the very first of the creation, and all of the other animals get created. And then it's because there's not a real relatability between the two, or between the earthling and the animals, that God decides to separate out of the earthling a male and a female. No, Adam, I don't want to see your scar. Anyway, the two then become one flesh, and there's a relationship between the Adam and the Eve. And then there's this whole story and drama in Genesis 2 and 3 that's really about human origins and why do we die, and why do we have certain abilities but not all of the same kinds of abilities that God has. And then, of course, as we read this, it's easy to think that Adam was a male person rather than the earthling that was then divided up into the Adam as a male person and the Eve as a separate person. So it's easy to read into this that the Adam was always male, and therefore it's easy to read into it that that male the males came first, so the males should be more important than the females. We've also read a lot of other things into this story, including a fourth century bishop inventing the theology of original sin, which the Eastern Orthodox Church still doesn't believe in, and most Jews don't believe in original sin because it's not a part of the way that they read this story. So that becomes a later way that people read this story to try to give themselves meaning around it as well, but it's not there in the earliest portion of it. And we even see the beginnings of a theology of the devil come out of this conversation, and setting up this kind of contest and this conflict between Jesus and the angels on one side and the devil and his demons on the other, that gets developed even out of this early scripture that really doesn't talk that much about it, but we have to take a bunch of scripture from other places to impute it into that. If anything, what we have is a story of trying to understand human shame, human blame, understanding why we do bad things, and understanding why we have limited life cycles. And even an angel not allowing those earliest humans, the Adam and the Eve, to go back into this garden for fear that they would eat of the truth, or of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So in some ways, when I read these stories, it really is an explanation about why there's death, why there's pain, why there's suffering, why even hunger exists. And if anything, I think we should be reminded that we're earthy. We're dust. And when we look at the other things that we try to impute into this story, like even Paul does, he tries to use that creation story as an excuse for why men are more important than women. And we've allowed that to become normative in our culture, right? I wish for no housework, no cooking, no cleaning. Poof, we'll make you a man. That's what will get you out of all of those things, because we've so assigned those duties to just one part of the human family. So if we recognize that there's a power hierarchy in the ancient world that always put men at the top, and then the women and the children and the slaves, when we read this story, we can see that Eve was framed, right? That Eve was blamed for taking of the fruit, when Adam was just as guilty of eating of the fruit of the tree as Eve was. She may have been the first and may have participated in inviting him to do so, but he chose to do so either to stay with Eve or to, in order to keep other parts of the commandments given to them in the garden, or other things like that. But it's easy sometimes for us to see that this complementarity between men and women, especially around creating children, was seen as normative. And then when we hear of other cultures like Native Americans who have had same-sex marriages that were well, the marriages themselves weren't upheld by the Supreme Court today, but the ability for gay and lesbian and transgender people to have employment protections was. It doesn't always work in that same way. Here's Pretty Shield, medicine woman of the Crow Nation, who said back in the early 1900s, Christian leaders stand on our soil and claim gay marriage has never occurred here. Over 130 tribes of every region of North America perform millions of same-sex marriages for hundreds of years. Their statements are both hateful and ignorant. Your homosexual was our two-spirit people, and we considered them sacred. In fact, many of the two-spirit people were seen as people that should become medicine men and medicine women, to be able, because they were able to speak to this world and the next. They were seen as spiritual leaders because of their sexuality or their gender identity. Even when we think of the different ways that we think of the world with a lot of these systems of understanding ourselves and our relationship with others, gets questioned when we hear parts of the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus said, when you make the two one, and when you make the inside is the outside, and the outside is the inside, and the upper is the lower, and when you make the male and the female into a single one, so that the male is not male and the female is not female, and when you make eyes in place of an eye, and a hand in place of the hand, and foot in the place of a foot, an image in place of an image, there shall you enter the kingdom. It's this mystical union of elevating both our masculinity and our femininity into being whole people that we find a different kind of salvation in these Gnostic Gospels, a salvation that comes from enlightenment rather than atonement. So when we look at our relationship, and science really does a great job of helping us recognize how related we are to all of the other animals, and especially the other primates, we can recognize a lot of the same kinds of abilities in chimpanzees, in other great apes that we have with ourselves. Some of them even are able to learn sign language. And when we look back in this world, we can see that we're related to all other mammals, to the same rodent-like being that lived 65 million years ago. Whether we're whales or humans or gorillas or giraffes, we're all related to this same ancestor that lived 65 million years ago. And some of those ancestors went back into the oceans, and some of them stayed on land, but we all have 3 middle ear bones. We're all warm-blooded. We take care of our young. We feed milk to our young. We have body hair. We're all different kinds of mammals, and we share a lot of these same different traits. And even elephants grieve their dead. And we've seen even forms of culture expressed in the way that elephants relate to each other. And we see very similar things in our closest cousin, the chimpanzees, who are able to communicate and able to show their sentience at different levels. But even as we look at our history, we recognize there's great diversity within the human family, right? Even if all Homo sapiens left Africa 200 to 500,000 years ago, there were other cousins, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans and Floresiensis and other hominids that lived in other parts of the world that we are or may be related to, that have influenced our skin color, what kind of hair we have, and express the diversity that we have within the human family. And this points out that we're all related, number one, and that we're co-creators with God. When we look at this diversity, we're able to, and the abilities that we have as human beings, we're also able to co-create and change the world that we're in. And what we've lost as Westerners is that sense of communality that we see among the Ubuntu theology of South Africa, of others, because we've kind of taken on this hyper individuality. In some ways, we're reclaiming this communal interconnectedness with all nature, because what we're seeing in our science and what we're even reclaiming in our theology is that we're all one. And I think a part of that is, if you'll give me 5 more minutes to get through this last portion of my presentation, is because of some really radical theologians that were also scientists. And one is my favorite, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was silenced by the Catholic Church. He was probably 2 generations ahead of the Church, scientifically and theologically. We're just now starting to claim and understand a lot of the things that he was saying. I think he influenced a lot of process theologians as well. But he said the day will come when, after harnessing the ether, the winds, the tides, gravitation, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And on that day, for the second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire. He's encouraging us to see our evolution in the future more as a spiritual evolution. So this process theology, seeing the universe as creative, interrelational, dynamic, open to the future. In process theology, God is relational, present in every moment of our lives and in all entities and levels of being. The world is interconnected, in effect a giant ecosystem where what harms or blesses one harms or blesses all. It recognizes that there's these 2 worldviews, science and religion, And both of these worldviews can go even deeper into their own world, and they need to be more in conversation with each other. And especially around these questions: how can I have a faith that honors both science and the Bible? And why does God cause bad things to happen? And especially trying to understand theodicy, because I think a lot of our definitions for God tries to protect God from being capricious, and especially an all-powerful God that is all good. We wonder why that God doesn't do more to bring about real change towards the good in this world. But when we understand and see and trying to make one cosmology or worldview out of both our science and religion, we need to put them into conversation more. Whitehead, another early process theologian, said you cannot shelter theology from science or science from theology, nor can you shelter either of them from metaphysics, or metaphysics from either of them. There's no shortcut to truth. So he says that there's two ways to do theology. You can do it confessionally, which is kind of where the history of Christianity has done it, coming up with various doctrines based on a supernatural, infallible origin, considering itself immune to rational critique. Or you can try to do it in a more transdisciplinary way that brings science into play, committed to the assessment of the validity of religious beliefs, rejecting the idea that truth claims are immune to criticism, and interested in the truth and the coherence of our worldviews, and changing our worldviews if we find that they don't work anymore. Because in many ways, this supernaturalism or deism on the left, where God works and affects on the world, is very different than the pantheism that we saw of the ancient world, where God and the world are the same, or atheism, where there's just a world and there's no divine presence there. In panentheism, which is the place where most process theologians come to, there's this overlap between where God and the world interrelate, right? And it's different than supernaturalism, where God only answers prayers the way God wants to, but it may not be what you want. This basically moves on from saying God has to be omnipotent or almighty or all-powerful to be more focused on the omnipresence, the everywhereness of God, and that God doesn't choose to abandon or to abuse our free will, but God is persuasive and lures us with this love power into the world that God is trying to create, and we can either participate in that or not. Does that make sense? This shared power in process theology is really the power of being, the power to affect, the power to choose, the power to love. And it's this interdependence between God, who invites us into this world that might lead us towards a better future, and our ability to answer that lure with our own lives and actions. So Whitehead's passion was determined to take all of the evidence, both spiritually and scientific, into account, to create one rational scheme of thought that's better for science and religion, a harmony of truth, and to overcome the real problems facing civilization. Religion and science can both be dangerous when they don't take the other into account. That's an important piece that Whitehead offers to us. And he says that the main science for science was naturalism, sensationalism, atheism, or materialism, whereas religion, the main problem is supernaturalism, or potentially superstition around some kind of way of looking at the world that has no claim on what we know about the truth and about the world. And here's the interesting outcome of this, because this process worldview invites us to have cultural humility, to understand our own tradition in relationship to other traditions and to other religious and scientific systems of thought and truth-making. So it invites us to view other religious traditions as beneficial in their own right, and that encourages us to know someone from other traditions so that our understanding of our own religion can grow as we are in interrelatedness with other folks. So it's a move from exclusivism to just inclusivism to pluralism, and it really encourages pluralism rejecting the belief that my religion is the only one with saving truths and values, divine inspiration, affirming the beliefs that other religions provide saving truths and values for the practitioners of those traditions, and affirming the idea that every great religious tradition is based on some true insight into the nature of reality, and may have come out of a specific cultural or historical place, but that we're going to be more able to understand our own religion when we're in relationship with people of other faith traditions, and knowing more about our neighbors and their faiths, believing that God loves all people, preventing more violence done in the name of religion, and increasing our friendships, creating communities of diverse religious communities, having an expectation of religious diversity rather than expecting everyone to accept the ideas that I believe, and encouraging this mutual learning and transformation. So these key themes are interrelational, interdependence, emergence with novelty, that there's this new thing that can come into the world for us to understand our relationship between our faith and the scientific understanding of the world in a dynamic changing process that's experiential, open to the future, where each of our freedom and our will is preserved and built into the nature of things. And so we see a lot of new teachings and new ways of viewing the creation stories, like that from cosmologist Brian Swim, who says, I'm convinced that the story of the universe that has come out of 3 centuries of modern scientific work will be recognized as a supreme human achievement. The scientific enterprise's central gift to humanity. For the first time in human history, we now have a creation story that is not tied to one cultural tradition, this new Big Bang, nor to a political ideology, but instead gathers every human group into its meaning. We're in the midst of a revelatory experience of the universe that must be compared in its magnitude with the great religious revelations, and we need only to wander about telling this great story to ignite a transformation of humanity. That's a huge paradigm shift, right? When we think of how that makes us and encourages us to think of the world in different ways. Thomas Berry is one of my favorite theologians. He's also a geologist, so I call him a geologian. In his book, The Dream of the Earth, he says, the basic mood of the future might well be one of confidence in the continuing revelation that takes place in and through the earth. If the dynamics of the universe from the beginning shaped the course of the heavens, lighted the sun and formed the earth, if this same dynamism that brought forth the continents and the seas and the atmosphere and awakened life in the primordial cell and then brought us into being and guided us safely through the turbulent centuries, there's good reason to believe that this same guiding process is exactly what has awakened in us our present understanding of ourselves and our relationship to this stupendous process. Sensitized to such guidance from the very structure and functioning of the universe, we can have confidence that awaits the human venture. And this encourages us to be more relational, not just with other humans and recognize the diversity within the human family, but also that we are interrelated and have relatives with every other part of the natural world. This takes away this illusion of separation that I think we have come to rely on, especially in the West, that has encouraged us to be hyper-individualistic and to grow in our own ways. So let me just end with this prayer, a version of the Lord's Prayer in new words. Wondrous God, lover of lion and lizard, cedar and cactus, raindrop and river, we praise you for the splendor of the world. We thank you that woven throughout the tapestry of earth are the varied threads of human diversity. Created in your image, we are many colors and cultures, ages and classes, gender and sexual identities. Different and alike, we are your beloved people. Free us, we pray, from fears of difference that divide and wound us. Move us to dismantle our attitudes and systems of prejudice. Renew our commitment to make this a household of faith for all people of every culture and stripe, that not all who worship and serve here may know the grace and challenge of faith. In our life together, grant us minds and hearts eager to learn, reluctant to judge, and responsive to the leading of your loving Spirit. In your many names we pray. Amen. Whew. take a big deep breath with me.
Thank you, Will. My goodness, I think you've just presented us with maybe a year's course, a 6-week course. I don't know. I just am astounded, and I so appreciate your really fascinating and complete presentation of science and religion. Ah, goodness sakes. Are you a professor? I mean, you should be a professor of science and religion. Maybe we don't have such a thing.
There are such, and most of them teach at the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences in Berkeley or in other such centers where there is conversation going on between scientific leaders and religious leaders. And one of the interesting things that I learned in my coursework there was that there are folks in different faith traditions that are offering different ways, like ex nihilo, creation ex nihilo, as a way of understanding the Big Bang, perhaps in a new way. Because, as I said, a lot of the scriptures that we have don't have a cosmology of ex nihilo, but that really is what that the creation was out of nothing. Yet that makes the most sense with the Big Bang. So that's where most Christians are, and especially Roman Catholic Christians are accepting of that theology today, even though it doesn't have a whole lot of support in the scriptural world.
Oh, I mean, I don't know where to go from here. So people must have some, questions or statements. Did anything stand out to you in Will's talk? There's so many points that he made, which were so. If you have something to share, please do.
You just have to unmute yourself like Gary just did. Gary, you want to go first?
I don't mind at all. Thank you. Absolutely. First, I'm going to start out with saying it's absolutely superb.
Yeah.
Your talk and the structure and the ground that you covered. I couldn't imagine doing all that you did in such a short period of time. In any case, you didn't say anything I didn't agree with. I just want to go back and provide another example for this train of thought that we're on today with this subject. I grew up largely UCC, but the important thing to know maybe about me is that undergraduate-wise, I majored in philosophy of science. I then went on into medicine, and I became a psychiatrist. And I'm now at the latter stages of my career. And one of the elements that has arisen in psychiatry, of course, was not just that in past decades there was conflict between religion and science, and a lot of psychiatrists did not want to touch spirituality with a 10-foot pole. That has begun to change, and during my most active clinical years, I readily came to the conclusion that you're really not doing a full assessment. You're not really using all the tools in your toolbox unless you can also help people if they have kind of spiritual practice. Make use of that. And I found that extremely interesting and very gratifying. Particularly illustrative of that is people who get into substance abuse and then 12-step. And with AA or Addicts Anonymous, there's so much spirituality that goes into a good recovery. And you really realize that these, what used to be seen as sort of two separate worlds, are really blended within us. And the task and the challenge is to somehow or other interlace them to what I think makes for a more likely to lead to a more successful life. So thank you very, very much. And I'm just so glad I didn't miss your talk.
Thank you, Gary.
Thanks for sticking with me, even though I went over my time.
Oh, no one would cut you short. Oh my gosh, you were on a roll. Oh, okay. Any other comments or?
I think Gloria unmuted herself. Gloria, did you want to say
Yes.
something?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you, and I am also in awe and so impressed and in agreement as Gary stated too. I have just a little short question. Where did the new Our Father come from, and could you get us a copy, all of us? Where did it come from?
Good question. I don't know. I can't remember where this came from. We've been using it in my congregation for a while, and I will put it in the chat room where you can copy and paste it. And it's especially good for the blessing of the animal Sunday.
Oh.
Sorry, Gloria. Go ahead.
Well, I know, I hate to admit it, I don't know how to copy and paste. Is there another way?
I can email it to you since I know you and have your email address.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah.
And maybe I'll send it to Susie and she can send it out to everyone.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
How does that sound, Susie?
Is Susie still here? So, Will, I have a question. You mentioned continuing revelation a couple of times in various aspects. How can you say just a little more about how you picture continuing revelation happening? How is it happening now? Concerning both of these worlds, science and religion.
So I would say that all that we're learning, well, even St. Paul would say that there's a book of scripture that tells us one thing about the world, and there's what we know about the world scientifically or naturally, that's another creation book. It's another book of Revelation. Both of them would be Revelation. One's written down. One is everything that we learn from nature in and around us. So that's definitely a part of the Christian tradition. There's also a part of our tradition that wanted to close that canon in the 400s to have agreed upon books that say these are the books that we'll do our liturgies from, and that's why there's 24 books in the Christian New Testament. They followed the same number of that the Jews put into the Tanakh, the Torah, the Netubim, and the Ketubim, the Torah, the writings, and the prophets. When Protestants did their Reformation in the 1500s and 1600s, many of them left deuterocanonical books out, what kind of were in between what was called the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament were these other intertestamental books, Wisdom of Solomon, Judith, Tobit, the Maccabees, and those stories. Most of the Protestants don't view them as canonical. Most Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and Episcopalians do. So that would be one form of revelation that gets canonized through ecumenical councils or through recognizing those books. Being Presbyterian, and one of the stories we love to tell as a more light Presbyterian church that is welcoming and affirming of LGBTQ, QI2S people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, two-spirit, and asexual or pansexual people, is a recognition of this story that comes from 1619. And Reverend Robinson was one of the Puritan ministers in the Netherlands, where a lot of the Puritans went as they escaped persecution in England. They went to the continent. They stayed there for a few years. They didn't want their kids to have to continue to learn Dutch. They wanted them to learn English, so they moved to the New World. Well, Reverend Robinson came and preached to these people on the boat, just as they were leaving to go to the New World to start the Plymouth settlement. And he said, don't get stuck where the Lutherans and the Calvinists have gotten stuck. God has more light and truth within the scriptures themselves, that as you read them, as you study them, as you ask the questions of how this applies for us today, God's going to give you more truth and light as you study those scriptures in its context that will answer the questions that you may have that the ancients never asked. So the UCC tradition is the God is still speaking. This is where it comes from. It's from this story of Reverend Robinson. And it's this recognition that we don't have to change the books themselves, but as we read them with our modern mind and our rationality, we can ask God and the scriptures that are there, we can test them to see what God might say to us today. And one of the ways that people have been doing that is around whether or not they should welcome their gay and lesbian children and transgender children into the family of faith. And as people look at the Bible and read it according to the way St. Augustine said that we should, according to the law of love, the more we read in the Bible, we see that there's some stories that are kind of against gays and lesbians in the Bible, and others point out that, yeah, Jonathan and David really did have a relationship, and it looked like it was more than just blood brothers. And they really committed themselves to each other as a couple, even though both of them, or David was given other wives and eventually became King David, and was given many, many wives and concubines during the peace treaties that he did when he was a king. There was this recognition that he was maybe bisexual and that he had this relationship with Jonathan. And so by going deeper into the context of the Bible itself and interpreting it according to the law of love, we can see that that there are queer people in the Bible and that they are included. Jesus is approached by a centurion who asked Jesus to heal his sweetie pie. In the Greek, it's kind of this term of endearment. And Jesus heals him even at distance without questioning the relationship between the centurion and his sweetie pie. And so the more people are reading closer in the text, the more that they're recognizing that maybe what they'd been told from tradition about not accepting gays and lesbians as full members of the congregation didn't have to be exactly that. And there's been new ways of looking for new light and new ways of interpreting the scriptures for what God might tell us today.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
It begins. It's a beginning, yes. Channing, I think you wanted to say something, and Robert wanted to say something. I don't know which Robert, but so
Robert Ash.
Oh, Robert Ash. Okay, Robert Ash, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Yes, you mentioned apostolic succession, and it sounded like that would lend an authoritative validity to interpreting biblical scriptures. Can you speak more about that, Will, please? And thanks for the presentation.
Sure thing. Yeah, apostolic succession means more to Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christians than it does to Protestant Christians like myself, especially since it has created a whole, not just a tradition of interpretation, but what has become authoritative, and not just statements, but authoritative acts in the name of God. So that was very similar to Roman culture, and it was easier for folks to accept that as part of Roman or Eastern Orthodox culture, and in that way the churches mirrored the kinds of authority and appeals to authority that came from a hierarchy. What we saw with the rise of the Protestant Reformation was very much iconoclastic against that level of hierarchy and recognizing the abuses that occur in certain portions of the political and religious hierarchy, and sought to reform those. Especially around indulgences, according to Luther, but even Calvin later had a lot of the things that he was trying to create that was what he thought were reforms that were needed to make the church more consistent with the biblical witness. And because he was a lawyer, he came up with a big thick book called The Institutes of Christian Religion. That was his explanation, that we don't have to have a magisterium or apostolic succession, but we can do it because we are able to read the Bible with our own minds, and it's the authority of Scripture itself that becomes the basis. So there are two different appeals to authority, one based on knowledge and one based on tradition and the hierarchy. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Hey, Channing, you had a question, statement?
Well, thank you so much. I remember asking you a few weeks ago, or saying to you how much I was looking forward to your presentation. And you said, well, gosh, I have several speaking things coming up for that. And I'm just amazed at how comprehensive and thorough and expansive your presentation was. I mean, every single part of it really enlightened me. So thank you so much. My question is, could you maybe provide us with three books or three pieces of reading material that would be really helpful for people who are, in many different situations? Many of us are retired. We were looking forward to exploring new ideas and expanding our knowledge. And I think that would be really helpful. I myself have not read Brian Swimm's book yet, but I do have it. And so I was just wondering if you could maybe list about 3 to 5 books that would be really good reading for us.
Okay, so a lot of the things that I've shared today are based on my own interpretations and my own understanding of Genesis and church history. You may not find it in other places, so because some of it's my own religious anthropology. I'll mention The Cosmic Christ by Matthew Fox, which is on creation spirituality. And I think this is, I'm adding it to the email to Susie that she can share with you all. I think this is one of the most radical books for modern Christianity, because it tries to help us see the story of the Bible through an experience of spiritual practices that enable us to reclaim an earth-based spirituality. And I think that is important because it helps us reclaim science in its best ways, and the best that we can know about the world through science and the interconnectivity of all things and this new way of viewing the universe. And it sends us back to our church history, and especially for Protestants like me, for many of us, we didn't grow up with spiritual practices that were central in the monasteries. Lectio Divina, centering prayer, deep meditation, praying the hours, walking the labyrinth, and these spiritual practices that Christians have been using for years and years and years have just in the last 30 or 40 years been being reclaimed by Protestant Christianity, recognizing we may have thrown a part of the baby out with the bathwater when we were so iconoclastic against all of the stained glass windows and all of the teachings of that era. We lost a huge aspect of monastic spirituality. Some Protestant groups have been trying to reclaim that, creating their own new monastic movement. There is a new monastic movement, and it includes a lot of even centrist to right-wing Christians that are reclaiming this in a new way to have a more experiential Christianity, and to have one that will help us heal the planet, especially understanding we're so close to so many of the tipping points, and the climate crisis is so real, and we need a spirituality to help us empower ourselves to be able to be the change that we want to see in the world when it comes to that. I'll have to think about a couple other books, but that's the one that I may think of right off the top of my head.
Well, I would like to suggest the great work by Thomas Berry.
Thomas Berry, definitely the great work. The other one is John Spong, Jack Spong, the Bishop of New Jersey. and Marcus Borg and a few other progressive Christians like John Dominic Crossan. I'm just going to put their names here, and I'll put books that they've written. I'll fill it out before I send this email. And the Jesus Seminar have all influenced me greatly, especially looking more closely at not just the texts and even the sayings of Jesus and trying to understand them in context with the four Gospels, but also the Gospel of Thomas, that most scholars have now put as an earlier document, or we can discern what portion of the Gospel of Thomas was written before the Gospels and put those more in conversation with the four canonical Gospels. And rethinking even some of our ecumenical documents like the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, and trying to discern what came from the original impulse of Jesus of Nazareth and what didn't, and what maybe came more from Greek philosophy or other places than, if we're after this, trying to claim and reclaim a way of following Jesus of Nazareth. How do we do that? Number one, without being anti-Semitic. Jesus never stopped being a Jew, right? And how do we do that in a way that doesn't check our head at the door? So the Jesus Seminar is the other piece there. And I'll add some. I had actually hoped to go to the Jesus Seminar conference in March, but COVID-19 had other plans for all of us. But I keep up with a lot of those scholars and am influenced by them quite a bit.
And I might also thank you so much, Will. I might also add that there are two institutions here in California that are doing cutting edge work on the new science. And that is IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is based in Petaluma, and also the California Institute of Integral Studies, which is in San Francisco. And I think that anything that's published by those two organizations would have, great bearing on some of the more progressive scientific work that's happening, or especially around the area of consciousness and understanding.
And field studies. Yeah, I think there's a lot we can do with energy fields and understanding the interconnectivity of all things in that way too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, all of those places that you mentioned, I've been influenced by as well.
Yeah, and that's so good to see that the modern science is moving away from just materialism and into this new field.
Yeah, there's a really good book by Richard Tarnas called Cosmos and Psyche. That's a really good kind of foundational book for integral thought. And integral philosophy is kind of the next step beyond process theology in many ways.
And that's Ken Wilber, right?
Ken Wilber and a few other folks too. I think I see Peter Nelson unmuted himself. Did you?
Yes, maybe it's too long for an email. For this, but I had several agreements, like on science removes superstition and God created the universe and it's reflected in the universe. I was curious when you went on to God as part of the universe, which I think I understand, and it's not pantheistic. I was curious about the co-creation part. Could you elaborate more on that? Where does it fit? What's the purpose of emphasizing that?
Yeah, being co-creators with God. A lot of this comes out of the work of Matthew Fox and creation spirituality, and part of it is recognizing, imago Dei, that we're created in the likeness and image of God. And when Catholics say that, they often emphasize those communicable attributes that humans have with God. There are certain attributes God has that we don't have. But they would emphasize that our ability to care, our ability to communicate, our ability to show love, even judgment might be a part of these communicable attributes that we have. And because it looks like we have more abilities, and maybe it's these guys, the opposable thumbs, that gave us our ability to use the tools and manipulate so much, but also to write and to put down our thoughts and what we've learned for future generations, that we've been able to create enough abilities ourselves in these communicable ways that we are recreating the world in our own image in many ways. And so it's a recognition of the power of human ingenuity and scientific prowess. It's not always done in a positive way. We're invited to do so in a way that works with the created order rather than against it, to work with and creating space for all of the other creatures rather than making space just for all of humanity. I think that's where our climate crisis is coming from right now, because we're so overcrowding other species that we're now seeing that the viruses that they have are more communicable with us because of our interactions with these wild species. That if we gave them their space to be able to have enough space for the bats and the pangolins and all of these other wild animals, if we weren't using all of the space to create food for humans, but allowing space beyond just the deserts for other animals to be able to exist, then I think we'd be more in balance in that way. But it's more or less this recognition that our consciousness and our learning and aptitude allow us to participate on whatever lesser level with the ongoing creation that continues to go on, that we participate with God in that because of our scientific prowess.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yep. Go, Robert.
Yeah, okay. I enjoyed the lecture. You're very well informed. I have a couple of questions about atheism and what you're thinking is atheism is very popular today. I'm talking about people like Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens. And do you see atheism as people that are uninformed or unevolved? Or why did God create the atheists?
That's
might
great.
be a question, actually.
I don't think that they're uninformed. I have a friend who's an atheist that I think came to it quite naturally. The way he describes his growing up, he never had a fascination or a question about a divine creator. He was very much interested in understanding the scientific processes and physics that go into the creation of the universe as we know it. And he never had a tendency, spiritual or religious tendencies at all. I think a lot of the debates that have gone on over the last couple hundred years between atheists and theists, and theism as a definition of God that is out of the world, all-powerful, all-knowing, has been a philosophical debate, partly over power, who gets to have power, the church or the state. I think part of this debate has gone on because there's competing cosmologies. One that everything is created and held up by God versus that there's not a creator or a divine being at all, and that everything could have been created in very naturalistic ways through the mechanisms that we now understand around evolution. But in some ways, I think atheism grew up as a response to the philosophical theism of the Middle Ages and the modern era. And they've been having this conversation for the last 200 years. And most of the rest of the world has moved on to a postmodern world. But I think this is a conversation that goes on in the modern cosmology, because they're both trying to have preeminence in that way of viewing the world. Most of the rest of us have moved on and said, you guys just go over there and have your fight over there. We're gonna allow folks to believe in the best of science and the best of their faith tradition and work out what that means, recognizing that there are multiple truths in the ways that we understand the world and a God or not. But all of our language for God is metaphorical. It's based on myths, models, and metaphors, right? As Sally McFaig would say, who's also a process theologian and an environmental liberation theologian. And all of those metaphors break down at some level. So if we say that God is definitely a father, the metaphor that Jesus offered to his disciples is that God is like your daddy. And you can be as close to this God as you are with your daddy. And it was somewhat novel during his time. It wasn't completely novel. There were other Jews saying the same thing. But he was basically saying, you all can have the same mystical experience with God that I have. And if you follow my ways, then you will be able to live that out and show the people that you live around that that you can live like it's heaven on earth, even under Roman occupation. And other folks would want us to say, no, that metaphor of God as Father is central, and it has to be literal. And this is where the competition between the cosmologies and the metaphors and the myths and the models come into play. I do think humans are complex enough to be able to hold different myths and metaphors and models for what the divine looks like or how we experience it at different times of our life in different ways, and even in self-contradictory ways, because we're meaning-making animals and we use a lot of the metaphors and models and myths in understanding our world. And for me, I really like the model of the universe itself as the divine, that God and the universe are one and the same. So I have a less personal view of God. Other people for themselves are quite attached to a very personal view of God. And so it depends on which models and metaphors are working the most for them to help them make meaning of the time. And I totally understand how atheists can view the world without a divine creator. And I think that we should also be in conversation with them and the humanists and Buddhists that don't believe in divinities, Theravada Buddhists. Most of them don't believe in a deity. A lot of Mahayana Buddhists do. So it depends on different faith traditions and life philosophies that people find meaningful, and that influences a lot of the language that we use for each other. Did I answer your question, Robert?
Pretty much. One of the things I wanted to know is Dawkins, who's probably the leader and very popular, has written a number of books. He looks down on people who aren't atheists. He seems to think that they're uninformed and ignorant. And my opinion is that people who are theists are just as intelligent as atheists. What's your take on that?
I think the universe is a big conscious making machine. And as we come to understand our own consciousness and how we view the world, the more that we can recognize when we're looking through our own lenses as we're trying to describe the world, the more we'll be able to recognize for ourselves, oh, this is where this worldview is coming from. It's the prescription that I've created for myself with my study over my life. And for Dawkins, I think he still finds awe and majesty in the natural world. He describes that as a very religious experience for himself. There are others in the new atheist group like Christopher Hitchens, who later in his life became quite the Islamophobe. Sam Harris had some times like this as well, but he's tended to walk away from a lot of those things where he's tended to focus on all Muslims as terrorists. And it's really too bad that Christopher Hitchens, I think, shamed his previous academic and intellectual ability by using an ad hominem attack against other people without recognizing that this is a system that works for them and makes meaning for them. But I think a part of it is just recognizing that we're all individual, unique human beings. We all have different experiences in our lives that influence how we view the world. The more we can sit around a table and understand each other, I think the more we'll be able to have the give and take that helps us sharpen our own thinking or our own ways of viewing the universe, and might give us aha moments from an atheist or a Buddhist teacher that is powerful enough to help us see the interconnectedness of all things and to reclaim different parts of the religious and philosophical inheritance that we all have as humans.
Good, thank you very much.
I think we have more time. Thanks, Robert. Others want to unmute themselves? Gloria?
I just wanted to ask again, what did you call your Christianity? It was progressive, but you also had another term.
I am an eclectic Christian. It's hard to label me. In some ways, especially because I've influenced as much by the Jesus Seminar and academic disciplines of church history and such, that I'm a progressive, justice-oriented Christian. I would also say that I'm into creation spirituality. I also have been reclaiming some earth-based spirituality from different forms of paganisms over the last few years. So I would maybe use eclectic. And who knows what I'll be tomorrow.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Hey, Dorothy.
We talked about relationship as being common between both science and religion. I was curious about where you think prayer fits into this relationship between science and religion.
So prayer is one of those places where we can either use prayer as a form of asking or demanding that the universe agree with us and do what we want it to do, or we can view prayer, and I think, let me just share this real quick. That might be a gross overgeneralization of supernaturalism, but I think it's somewhat related to this. Why didn't God answer my prayer? God answers prayers the way God wants to, but it may not be what you want. As if sometimes we think that our prayers are something that if we ask God enough, that God will do something for us. I don't know that that's really not where I am anymore. It was when I was young, but it's not where I am anymore, because I view God as this power in between, luring us into the future that God desires for us, which I believe is a good future for each and every one of us, a place of justice and a place where we're able to not only have enough, but belong in community. So I think prayer is a spiritual practice that allows us to be able to train ourselves, whether it's with centering prayer, to be able to calm our hearts, to be able to not just let our wishes for whatever perfect future we hope for in the future, but it's a form of solidarity with people in need. I think it's an opportunity for us to be able to do the work inside. So whether that's praying little snippets of prayer with Lectio Divina and meditating on it and asking what God may speak through those individual or little cluster of words in that particular sentence into my particular life needs at this time, or it might be a practice that teaches my body how to be able to listen in greater ways without having to try to respond, listening to understand rather than listening to respond, and being able to be a conscious, peaceful presence for other people because of my meditation practice and my centering prayer, those kinds of things. So it's a little different view than prayer as asking for God for the goods.
Well, I wasn't thinking so much about asking, but I was thinking about how science is now talking about how prayer can actually influence a person's health. So that sort of thing I was thinking about, how the connection, with science and prayer, as well as how an individual views prayer.
So that's where the Institute of Noetic Sciences that Channing mentioned has actually been able to point out certain things about human experience in greater ways than we had ever any idea of before, right? They compared the brains of nuns and Buddhist monks who spend a lot of time in prayer and meditation, and they saw that some of the same parts of their brain were being lit up when they were in a state of prayer or in a state of meditation, and that it changes it increases our synapses in our brains that allows us to be able to think in greater ways and stay connected in those greater ways as well. So I think science is showing us how beneficial prayer or meditation can be, and how what the spiritual practices themselves do to our physiology and our ability to be present for other people. Yeah, I think that's a part of the diversity of the human family. It's interesting that we see very similar spiritual practices among people in very different parts of the world. Some of it's very inward, some of it's very ecstatic. In college, I did a class on religious anthropology, and I went to a Quaker silent meeting and a Pentecostal service, and I compared how both groups were after the same kind of spiritual experience, but they were going about it in radically different ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. Thank you.
And isn't there also some evidence that prayers from individuals affect people far, far away, and in plants and so on, that prayers have an actual physical effect in the world? And I don't know if any of us understand that connection, but do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's connected to field theory, and our like the Earth has a magnetic field that comes out of the North Pole and helps protect our planet from solar rays. Our bodies have, and especially beginning in our heart, has an electromagnetic field, and it looks a lot like the Earth's magnetic field. I don't have one of the pictures of it right here where I could show you, but I preached on this in my church. Have you ever had one of those experiences where the little hairs on the back of your neck goes up and you can tell that someone's behind you? I think it's because this electromagnetic field that actually goes farther beyond what we can reach with our fingers is a part of the electromagnetic experience as humans. And when we focus our energy and our prayers on the needs of another person or with other people, you've had that experience where you might have been in a group and you're holding hands and there's like a little spark in between your hands, and you can kind of feel that energy between each other as you have put your intention together to be able to create whatever it is that you're creating with your group experience at that moment. I think there's an aspect of that energy that's a very real part of what it means to be human. I think you're right, Ruth.
So if there's nobody else who has a question or a comment, Will, you have blessed us and in many ways, stimulated us intellectually and spiritually, and helped make more of a connection between religion and science.
Ed may have unmuted himself to ask something.
Okay, good.
I was wondering if in physics, quantum non-locality is something that has more of a spiritual aspect than a physical aspect, because it seems to be beyond what's possible under theories of Einstein or anyone else.
It's easy to just assign that to spiritual, or to assign it to just part of the basis of the quantum weirdness and the interconnectivity, that even when we're looking at this particle, it's affecting this other particle on the other side of the universe that it's somewhat connected to. But it's only when we're looking at it that it changes this particle. If we look at this particle, then it changes this particle. But when we're not looking at it, then it's Schrodinger's cat yet, right? And we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. I would hesitate to automatically say that that's more spiritual versus quantum physics, but it could be that we're using just two different metaphors for the same thing.
Well, I was thinking of the speed of the signal, which it has been said to be faster than the speed of light.
Yeah, that's the quantum weirdness that Einstein was pointing to. That I think is we still don't have a real grasp on. How can these particles be so connected that it's faster than what we think is a constant, like the speed of light? You're right.
Thank you.
We could call it spiritual. We could call it something else, and I think we tend to have a little bit more humility about that because we don't know what science is going to find in the next 50 years. And we don't know what paradigm shift is necessary for us to think of the world in different ways, for us to even grasp that part of the universe. That's the hardest part, is how do we prepare our minds to think of a different way of being. It was the hardest thing for Einstein and some of these other folks, is how do they think of the universe in a non-Newtonian physics way. What's interesting to me is that theologians are offering scientists new ways of thinking of the universe that might give an opportunity for the scientists to be able to think of the universe in such a different way that they might be able to make some leap forward in our knowledge of the nature of all things in the midst of those questions. So it takes a certain theological humility for us to offer that without demanding that everyone believe like we do.
Thank you.
Ian Peacock, blanking on the name of the theologian and scholar scientist that, I think his name, Arthur Peacock. I'm blanking on his name. Randy, are you still on here? Do you know? He had to go. Okay, Sarah, lead us on.
Well, I think that, we're going on 2 hours, and you've put out some excellent ideas for us to go away and think about. I feel like I should just go and sit for about 2 hours and let it all just sort of flow through me or let it all go and think about it in my dreams tonight. But I certainly appreciate your sharing, Will, and your knowledge in so many different fields and the way that you bring them together. The integration and the relationship that many of these different aspects have. And I very much appreciate your emphasis on there probably are as many, it's been said, there's many different religions as there are people, as there are individuals. And I really appreciate your emphasis on that. And yet to be able to find out about and understand the aspects of somebody else's spiritual life that you can kind of weave, as I've said before, a golden thread into your own personal foundation for religious beliefs. I too am pretty eclectic, and I bet most people that are interested in science and religion find themselves to be gathering information from a number of different sources, because that's where those two fields lead you. So, you have anything else to say as an ending? I just say thank you, and thank you to the participants. And if there's nothing else, then we'll see some of you in about a month for the next presentation of the big question.
And who is presenting then?
Kate Boisvert.
Boisvert, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Boy, how do you say it?
Boisvert.
Boisvert. Ah, French, huh? Boisvert. So, and she represents Sufism reoriented.
But she's also an astronomer.
Oh, is she? Oh,
she taught astronomy at Black Diamond Community College.
Wow. Well, there we go. There's science and religion. So that'll be interesting to hear her. So I can't quite remember the date. July, it's the third Monday, whatever it is, but I'll send out, the notice to the list. And all of you people who have been on this should be on that list also. So thank you, Will.
Thanks for sticking around for extra time.
Oh my goodness. couldn't do anything else.
Thank you, Will. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Have a great day.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.